Hi everyone, John Heath here again for Milton Rose Learning with another Let's Learn video on A Christmas Carol context. So if you're here to beaver up on all of your kind of history and the social stuff underpinning the text to get the high grades, then you're definitely in the right place. So we're going to have a look today at some of the key contextual factors underpinning the kind of the text. Then we'll look at how that context and all that history kind of filters into the text itself with the context in action, as we call it. And then we'll have a look at three really nice quotations that kind of illustrate and symbolize all the context. Okay then, so first off, let's dive in. So firstly then, just line that up. We've got, Victorian poverty and inequality, which was rampant in this period. So first off, it's important to know that Scrooge himself kind of symbolises Victorian selfishness, those in the upper class of Victorian society who didn't really care about poverty in this period. And Scrooge is almost a symbol of that, or an allegorical figure as we call it, whilst the Cratchits, Bob Cratchit and whatnot, embody kind of the working class who are working extremely hard through poverty and retain their dignity. So there's a big allegorical aspect to this, to the context. The second thing that you need to know really is the 1834 Poor Law. So it's a really harsh law passed by the government, and it made it very difficult for the poor to receive any government help, and it forced many into workhouses, which, if I'm honest, were probably worse than prison to a high degree. So it kind of forced the poor to kind of escape and never ask the state for anything, really. And Scrooge's early comments, like he says, are there no prisons? And that reflects the cruel, real-life Victorian attitudes towards poverty at the time, which Dickens is really critiquing in this text. Then moving on, we have some of the key context here then. So published in 1843, so the Industrial Revolution was very quickly kind of taking hold in Britain at the time. We were the first country to industrialise fully in the world. And Dickens wrote the novella during a time of rapid industrial progress and growth, but there was a darker side to it. So urban poverty, child labour and poor working conditions became the norm in this period, because there was a grab for profits and cash on the back of these massive factories. So the story then reflects Dickens's urgent call for social reform. We need to change this. The fact that children as young as 6 or 7 could end up in factories and then potentially get injured or die was just unacceptable, and it definitely was unacceptable to Dickens. So there's a real kind of issue there, a social issue. Then also there's the issue of Christian morality and redemption. So the story draws on Christian values of charity, redemption and compassion. So Scrooge's transformation, because he does come good in the end, represents the belief that anyone can change, and that moral duty lies at the heart of a better society. We can all do better. That's basically Dickens's kind of lesson, really, or didactic message, I would say, in an essay. The moral that he's trying to teach us all. Okay, then moving down here then, what are Dickens's actual views then? So in light of all of this kind of interesting context, what does Dickens think himself? Well, in my mind, this is, and when I'm teaching classes about this, I always say this book is a call for social reform. So Dickens believed that the wealthy had a moral duty to help the poor, not just to make money. So through Scrooge's transformation, he urges readers to show compassion, to show humanity, and to basically lead a better life and look after the weakest in society. Okay, I think there's a big call for social reform. That's a good phrase for your essays to use. Also, there's a massive critique of Victorian inequality. In the Victorian era, the rich had loads and the poor had barely nothing. There was massive wealth inequalities, and I think Dickens is really going for that. and criticising it. So he's exposing the harsh realities of poverty, child suffering and injustice in 19th century Britain. And he's demanding greater fairness and empathy from society. And it's important to know that this was the high point, or one of the high points of the British Empire, where we were going around civilising, in inverted commas, the rest of the world and telling them how to live. And Dickens would say, well, that's fine, but then look at how the poor are living in London and slums of big cities in Britain. It's not really on, is it? So there's a big critique of Victorian inequality that would be very good to get into your essays. Okay. Now, with some of the key context done, let's look at some of the context in action then. How does it play into the actual novel itself? Well, first off, industrial Britain and social division. Well, let's just have a look at that image for a second. You can see that as a kind of archetypal image of the Industrial Revolution, this was a pretty grim place, you know, and you're working in massive factories and you're working extremely long hours. So in terms of industrial Britain and social division then, so the stark contrast between Scrooge's wealth, very, very rich guy, and the Cratchit's poverty reflects the brutal realities of Victorian capitalism, where rapid industrial growth left the working class behind and the capitalists were making tons and tons of cash. So these wealth inequalities got out of control in this period. And Dickens exposes the urgent need for social justice. We need to share the money around the system a bit more so the working class don't live awful lives. I think that was basically one of the social messages. And you could see from the image, you know, if you're working class working in one of those factories, it was pretty grim, to be honest. Then in terms of responsibility then and moral reform. So Dickens uses Scrooge's transformation from a miser to a good Victorian Christian to argue that the rich have a duty to care for the poor. So the novella promotes a moral responsibility and it challenges the really callous, heartless attitudes of the elites towards poverty and hardship. Most Victorian gentlemen would say for the poor, well, it's their own fault. You know, that's it. You know, they need to work harder and that's it. And there's nothing we can do about it. Whereas Dickens would say, no, you have a moral imperative, a moral duty to actually do something about this poverty through philanthropy and distributing your money more evenly and looking after the poor, basically. Then child poverty and neglect, which was big in this period. And you can see in that kind of interesting image there, just kind of the kind of poverty and neglect that we're talking about. You know, this was extremely grim and it's an interesting visualization there. Now, in terms of then child poverty and neglect, so characters like Tiny Tim, who's a very young character, very vulnerable character in the text, and the allegorical figures of ignorance and want reveal how children suffered most from inequality. They always do. So things haven't changed there. Children are too young and weak to look after themselves. So in terms of poverty, they are the first ones who suffer normally. So Dickens highlights how a society that neglects its young and vulnerable is doomed to collapse. If we don't kind of sort this out and arrest this kind of poverty and actually share the wealth slightly more evenly, then we're just asking for trouble. And it's, obviously, 100 years or so after this, we have the dissolution of the British Empire and things like that. So maybe Dickens saw it coming, who knows. But nevertheless, I think child poverty and neglect through that character of Tiny Tim is a really big message within this text as well. So, with the context in action done, let's just go down here then and let's start looking at some of the key contextual quotes. Okay. So, first off then, as we can see from that image then, attitudes towards poverty in this period. So they were pretty grim, as I'm sure you're picking this up now. So are there no prisons and the union workhouses? Scrooge asks, and you can see a workhouse on the left there, that it's a grim place to be. So this chilling question reflects the harsh attitudes of the wealthy elite towards the poor in this period. Dickens uses Scrooge to criticise the cruelty of the 1834 Poor Law, which pushed more and more people into these horrible workhouses, extremely grim. The government had an economic policy called laissez-faire, and it basically means leave well alone. It basically means with the economy, just don't get involved. Just let the rich rise to the top and the poor just stay at the bottom, and it is what it is. Like that was laissez-faire. And Scrooge kind of symbolises that laissez-faire attitude to poverty there, and he doesn't really care about just chucking them all in workhouses if needed. Really awful social kind of view. Okay, then coming down here, we have Scrooge, there he is. Okay, now social injustice and Malthusian thinking. Okay, sounds very technical, so let's unpick that together. Now, there was a guy called Thomas Malthus, and he, a social thinker, and he basically came up with the lovely idea of if the population gets out of control and things like that, well, just let the poor die. It doesn't really matter. It just decreases the surplus population, and let the rich just kind of live on. Yeah, I said it was a nice theory. It was absolutely awful. And Scrooge kind of echoes the Malthusian kind of social beliefs. So he said he mentions decrease the surplus population. He's almost talking like Thomas Malthus there. So it's a direct echo of Malthusian beliefs, which were quite prevalent in Victorian society. And Dickens, though, is mocking this heartless economic logic to highlight how such views dehumanise the poor and justify social injustice. You know, Malthus is an awful theory, just believing, as we say, if there's too many people, we'll just let the weak ones die. It just doesn't matter. That was how harsh and brutal Victorian society could be. And Scrooge at the start of the novella kind of symbolises that. It would be very good for you to research maybe Thomas Malthus and his social thinking, because that would be really impressive if I saw that in any essays from my students or students who I tutor. So that would be very good for you to have a good look at. And then finally, as an interesting quote, it's not all bad, because redemption is possible. So with Scrooge again, he says, I will honour Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. So Scrooge does undergo a moral transformation. Change is possible. Okay. So this pledge reflects Dickens's ideal of moral and social rebirth. We can live better lives. And it encourages not just Scrooge, because obviously Scrooge is just a literary construct, but it encourages the readers to embrace compassion, generosity and community spirit. So not just at Christmas, but always. Okay, so to tap into, in the Victorian era, to tap into Christian kind of ethics about what's right and start leading a better life. Okay, it doesn't all have to be Thomas Malthus and kind of, workhouses and not caring about the poor. We can all lead better lives, and I think that's the moral at the core of A Christmas Carol, which is just as relevant today as it ever was. Okay, so with that in mind, let's just do a little kind of recap just before the end. So we've looked at some of the key contextual factors, picked apart that 1834 Poor Law and some of the wild wealth inequalities in industrial Britain and during the Industrial Revolution. We've also looked as well at just 3 really good quotes which you can use to illustrate your knowledge of context, such as Thomas Malthus, the workhouses in this period, and also Christian theology and Christian ethics. And there you go. So I just remain to say, if you found this video useful, then don't forget to hit the like, subscribe and tap the bell icon, because it just helps the channel grow as always. And keep an eye open for future content. We'll be doing more videos on this and other key texts moving forward. So it just remains to say thanks for watching and take care.